G'day folks, and welcome back to another edition of the Rough Consensus podcast. And today I sat down with Bob Burnett and we had a fantastic conversation about the Bitcoin mining space, the incentive structure, the risk of pool centralization, how we think mining can play out long term, what does it look like in a nation state type scenario. Now, mining is a fascinating field which is very, very poorly misunderstood. In my view, far too many people look at the declining block subsidy and they just assume that that's a problem. In many ways, I think it's far more nuanced than that, and that actually is not the problem, the big risk that actually remains. So I think this was a fantastic conversation. I really love the way that Bob thinks about these things, so I think you're going to enjoy this. And if you haven't checked out our post called Securing the Bag, that's got a lot of the backstory for where this particular conversation came from, and that's my thoughts. And a lot of those concepts we touch on, iterate on, and build on in this conversation. So let's get stuck into it. G'day folks, and welcome back to the Rough Consensus podcast. And today we've got a special guest, Bob Burnett, and we're going to be talking all about mining, the role that mining has, the incentive structure. Mate, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, James. Great to see you.
So I think it might be mining is one of these really interesting sectors where it's such an important role of Bitcoin as a network. It used to be, in my view, a much more important role in terms of the supply dynamics, but now increasingly mining it's kind of a background character from the market side of perspective of the equation, because the mining rewards get smaller and smaller, but it is still such an integral part. How did you actually end up in the world of mining? What was it about both Bitcoin and mining itself that really sucked you in?
Well, why I got there and why I'm still there are two different answers. I'll say that to begin with. I came in through the back door, and probably I'll state to begin with, I'm very much a Bitcoin maximalist, but my story starts in a shitcoin, but in a different kind of way. So my background's in system design. For older members watching, I was the chief technical officer for a company called Gateway, which was in the 90s and 2000s, one of the biggest PC companies in the world. We were a Fortune 200 company, made about 10 million PCs a year, and I led product development there. So the reason that's relevant to this conversation was in 2017, I had left that industry for about 10 years, and I got a phone call from an old Gateway acquaintance who said, "Hey Bob, I'm opening a large Ethereum mining farm, and I need somebody to design several hundred Ethereum mining servers. Can you do it?" So there's a long story that goes with that, but the end of the story is I said yes, I could do it. And at that time, equipment was not very professionally designed, let's just say. By the way, in the Bitcoin side or the Ethereum side, whatever it was you were mining, it was pretty much crap. Still largely is, actually, but that's a different story. So I did that for him, and started a company that we would now know as Barefoot Mining to do that. After fulfilling that order, we started going to other people saying, "Hey, would you like to buy one of these?" And lots of people started saying yes, but most of them didn't just want to buy the computer. They wanted somebody to host it for them too. So that forced us as an enabler to sell more computers to provide hosting. Now, to this point, I would say I was still pursuing this purely for fiat purposes and purely as a computer guy fulfilling a service, right? And then we started saying, well, these appear to be making a lot of money, so let's take the profits and buy some of our own servers to mine for ourselves. So that was 2017. By the time we were into 2018, I started to look deeper at what we were actually doing. And let's just say the luster of Ethereum started to wear out. I started to see warts in it. Of course, Bitcoin was the king then as it is now. So we started to say, well, what is Bitcoin? Can we participate? Unfortunately, because we couldn't get access to the ASIC, we decided we wanted to start to mine Bitcoin too. We couldn't get access to the ASICs, so we signed a relationship with Bitfury to become the North American distributor of Bitfury's equipment, which we did, and that got us into Bitcoin. And then over the course of 18 months or so, we kind of weaned completely off of Ethereum and went purely into Bitcoin. And by that time, I was into the rabbit hole, as you know, probably everybody watching this is, and realized that Bitcoin was the answer, that Ethereum wasn't. We're still seeing those warts of Ethereum rear their head today, you know, like with the Bybit hack and Vitalik trying to decide if he wants to roll back the chain, and those sorts of things are evidence that we made the right decision about, you know, where to pursue. But that said, so I got in as a computer guy mining Ethereum. I'm still doing it because, to me, you're right in some of your opening comments. You know, people have lost the narrative about what mining is, how it works, how important it is. But to me, at the end of the day, it is the heartbeat of everything that happens in Bitcoin. And to a certain degree, it will live or die based on what happens with mining. I think there's a great responsibility that comes with Bitcoin. Miners ultimately are the guardians of the network. We'll talk about it more. I think a lot of times people look at mining and they think about it purely from an economics perspective. I think a lot of times the bigger public miners do a disservice to the way mining is looked at by the community, because, as you said, you said this. I guess I'll maybe even explain it now. Essentially, most of the companies that call themselves miners are not miners. They are hashers. And there's a huge distinction between being a hasher and a miner. So a hasher is someone or an organization that possesses the computing power and they have access to the energy. But what they do with it is completely different than what a miner does. The predominant mode of operation for instance, the public miners is to abdicate their responsibility to a secondary party, a pool, who actually does the mining. So I call them mercenary hashers. They are renting their computing power to someone else. Now, the pool is the organization interacting with the base layer. They are running the node that manages a local mempool, and they make the choices about the block templates that they wish to process. And they simply pay the mercenary hashers for access to their equipment. And on a technical basis, they actually don't even have to send work about the Bitcoin network to the hashers. They pay them in Bitcoin. It looks like the work that they're doing is Bitcoin, but it doesn't necessarily even have to be Bitcoin. So, and by the way, it could be Bitcoin Cash, or it could even be a completely non-Bitcoin related set of work that they're sending to them.
And sorry, just to jump in. So for people just kind of visualize this, not with it, I'll get some of the technical details right, but essentially the pool it looks like the pool is the miner, right? If you look at it from a network level, it actually looks like the pool is the miner. They have their mempool. They then select which transactions go into the block, and then they're essentially using whatever hash power is pointed to them to say, hey, look, I found this block. So in many ways, those hashes are providing a service. They're getting there's almost like an off book or it's an off chain contract between the pool and the miner. You will get paid X amount of your share. But ultimately, to the network level, the pool looks like it's doing the mining, which I think is a really interesting dynamic and just helps people frame this up as to why the pool versus miner, those two things are actually separate in many instances.
Correct. And to be clear, too, there is no such thing as a mempool or the mempool. Every node has its own mempool. So the mining process starts. So imagine, we'll just use Foundry as an example because they're the biggest. So Foundry is running a node. It is first selecting through a series of filters. They can either be running Bitcoin Core or Bitcoin Nuts. It doesn't matter, but they're different clients that they're running. They set a series of parameters that determine what transactions they will even consider in the mempool, in their mempool. Okay, so they're listening to all the broadcast transactions and deciding which ones they wish to have. Then let's just pretend that a block just got mined. Okay, so we're starting fresh. They will pick typically about 4,000 transactions from the mempool, from their mempool, based on whatever criteria they wish, by the way. They can decide that.
And they could essentially, by that framework, they could say, I don't want to look at any transaction coming from this address. I'm just going to pretend it doesn't exist, and therefore they wouldn't include it in their template. That's the idea of the mempool rules and how they could, in theory, be a censorship type attack.
Yeah, and they could say, I'm going to pick the oldest transactions in the pool. I'm going to pick only ones that have odd number. They're only odd numbers. So they can use whatever criteria they wish, right? Then they're going to take that block they'll assemble the block template, which, by the way, includes creating a Coinbase transaction, which is the first transaction in the block. It's the only transaction that is required. And they can select up to the maximum block subsidy at the time. By the interesting little subtlety there, hopefully you caught that.
Yes.
Means like right now they can pick up to 3 1/8 Bitcoin to award themselves, but they do not have to pick 3 1/8. They could pick 2 or 1 or 0. They can.
And there are a handful of blocks in history where they actually didn't give themselves the full reward, right? So technically speaking, the 21 cap, which actually isn't a cap itself, but there's actually some coins that will never be mined because they weren't given, the miner didn't give it to themselves.
Correct. And then they can add the fees from the transactions in whatever the current state of the block is. And then the output, if it's any pool other than Ocean, they will direct that output to an address that they control. Now, they'll send that template to all of the machines connected to their pool. Those machines will get a message at that point to stop working on whatever they were working on and start working on this. Okay? Now, usually what happens is the first block they send to the miners is empty. Okay? Because it takes them a small amount of time to assemble. They want them to stop working on the old block because it's no longer valuable, right? Stop whatever you're doing as fast as you can. Start working on this empty thing. And then usually, sometimes it's milliseconds, sometimes it's a couple seconds, the fully loaded block will come in. And then they stop working on the empty template and they start working on that. The mempool, because it takes a little while to mine a block, right? Their mempool is continually being updated. If they see a transaction with higher priority based on whatever criteria they're working, they'll send additional templates. So between one block being mined and another block being mined, they're actually very possible that several hundred different block templates from the same pool have been issued to the miners in the pool. So it's not like, so I think part of the reason I'm going through this detail is to dispel, I think, some of the misunderstandings that are out there.
And I think it's important because people can then visualize it in their head. You can almost see the sequential steps that go on. And once you can see the steps, you can see where a censorship attack, for example, could slot in. Or, this is also why when empty blocks get mined, sometimes it's literally just because it got mined before they got the next template. So they just get the free one. You may as well work on the free one and get the subsidy because you know you're going to get that. And then the fees are really an additional bonus. And sometimes that's just how probabilities work.
Yeah. Yeah. So like each year there's about 150-ish blocks that are empty. And it's mainly because in that second or two window that is between so the empty block almost immediately follows the previous block. It's very rare for it to be seconds or numerous seconds or minutes after. It's like, boom, it's right on. Interesting little tidbit too. While the mean block time is slightly less than 10 minutes, it's like 9 minutes and 50 seconds. I'll give you a trivia question, James. Do you know the median block time?
I have seen this before, but it is an interesting. Yeah, no, I can't remember off the top of my head.
It's about 6 minutes and 40 seconds. So if you're ever at a bar and you're gonna, bet on like who's gonna buy the next round, you could throw something out like, "Hey, I'll give you," bet your friend and just say, "Hey, I'll take under 8 minutes, and you can have over 8 minutes." And if they're not real knowledgeable, they might fall for the.
I did win a trivia question on the mean though, because everyone was like, "Oh, 10 minutes, 10 minutes." I'm like, it's actually about 9 minutes and 58 seconds or something. And the reason for that, am I correct that there is a higher probability that it will be shorter than longer? And the reason is because hash rate basically just goes up and to the right. So because we've had such a long period of time where more hash rate is coming online, difficulty hasn't adjusted up to where it will go. And as a result, you've got more miners looking for a less difficult puzzle, so to speak.
Correct, because you've stated it well. But you're always looking backwards, so the difficulty adjustment reflects somewhere between a day ago and a week ago, and not the present state. And since hash rate's always growing, that gets you like I haven't updated my stat in a bit. I think it's like 9:53 or something on that order. 9 minutes 53 seconds.
I mean, I've been seeing on my block like even hash rate getting above 100. I mean, there was a couple of points where it hit 1,000 exahash, but I think that's one of these anomalies. But we're up in the 800s now, which is incredible.
Yeah, I mean that I want to be clear too. It really didn't hit 1,000 exahash. It
always put a moving average on hash rate.
Yeah, it's just that we had better as a community. An ecosystem, we had better than expected luck over a very tight window. So don't look at any hash rate average. I like 2 weeks or more.
Yes.
I think then you
makes sense over a difficulty window, 14 days.
Yeah. And I really like 30. I think that 30 is really the best reflection of, where we sit. So we were talking about this block thing, and I do want to say full disclosure. I am on the board of directors of Ocean. I'm actually wearing an Ocean sweatshirt. I just realized. So I am not here to as an Ocean advertisement or promotion. I just want to say that. However, I am proud of a few of the things that Ocean does, and one of the things Ocean does is it allows the miner to run a node and run a server and create their own templates, because and the miner also gets paid directly from the Coinbase. So if we unwind that a little bit, we'll do that last part first. At Ocean, the miner gets paid directly from the Coinbase. What does that mean? When I said the Coinbase transaction, in most templates, let's say with Foundry, goes to Foundry. That means that the miners or hashers that are part of that pool are getting money not from the block that's being won, but just from some general wallet managed by Foundry.
So probably a better way to think about that is it's actually a custodial service. A Foundry takes possession of the coins, and then it's at their discretion to send in another transaction to their hashes. Am I correct? Does that mean that... Because typically a Coinbase is the only transaction where there's no input, but there is an output because it's creating those coins. Does that mean that Ocean actually I should have actually looked at this. So they have a no input, many output Coinbase. Is that how that works?
Correct.
Correct. Fascinating.
You can see, there's a technical reason, but we've had 70, 80, 100 different outputs on the Coinbase
Interesting.
transactions.
And why isn't that more of a norm? That seems quite commonsensical to me.
Well, it's because the hashing community has, in my opinion, gotten very lazy. Number one. They've abdicated this responsibility in exchange for something that at least they perceive as very important, and that is consistent revenue. So outside of Ocean today, there really are no pools who only pay for block wins. Okay, which historically that payout method was called PPLNS, which is also pay per last known share. Ocean calls it system tides. It's just a slightly nuanced version of that. Okay, but if you're with Ocean, you only get paid when Ocean wins blocks, which means you can go 2 or 3 days without getting paid, and then you can get 3 in a day if we win 3 blocks, right? Well, the other pools use a system called FPPS, full pay per share. And what it essentially says is the pool is going to take all the risk on whether or not in any window of time they win blocks. They take all the risk. And every 10 minutes or every time a block gets won, they pay the people in their pool whether they won or not. So they're taking that risk, which I'm going to subtly change something you said before. It's not just that the money goes from the Coinbase to the pool and then gets distributed. It's not that clean. It's actually you're getting just paid from a general wallet.
Interesting.
The money that the Bitcoin coming to the hashers connected to a Foundry type pool is just Bitcoin. It has, you could trace the UTXO history of it, obviously, if you wanted, but it's just kind of coming out of a general pool. And it has to be that way because the way that an FPPS pool, you could almost think of it as a insurance project or a product or a hedging product. Like they just have this big pool of Bitcoin. And they have to have a real big pool of Bitcoin to pay the hashers connected to their pool, because if they run into a really bad series of luck, which will happen at times, they may have a period where they go negative significantly. Okay. Now, the opposite can be true too. But when the opposite happens, they win and win, right?
That's the trade-off for consistency. Basically, the pool takes the up and down risk, but because and this I imagine would benefit economies of scale once you're big enough that you can in fact have the treasury, have the hedging capacity. It makes sense, right? The more capital you have, the easier it is to run a strategy like this. Whereas Ocean makes sense for individual hashers, or individual miners, I suppose, is probably a better term.
Well, I actually disagree, James. I think it's the opposite, interestingly.
Yes.
But I think it's a symptom of so if you're big, let's say you have 10% of the world's hash rate, just use that as an example. Well, statistically, you're going to win 14 to 15 blocks every day. And there might be, if you solo mined, so you don't use a pool at all. And if I was that big, that's exactly what I would do. Because I might win 11, I might win 17, I might win 13. But statistically, over any period of time, I'm gonna get like 15. Like, there's about 150 blocks a day, right? So, in that case, the variance doesn't hurt that much, and I know I'm gonna cover my cost of operations even in the worst cases. And most mining organizations like mine, we run on 30-day cadences. Okay, so I don't need today to be a great day. If today's a great day or a bad day, it doesn't matter. I pay almost all of my bills in 30-day windows. So I just need relative consistency over that period of time. And if I have 10% of the global hash, the other thing is, if you are one other thing I should mention about FPPS pools is they use a formula to determine what a share is worth. And what they do is there's slight variances from pool to pool, but mostly what they do is they look back 144 blocks. So let's say there's a block right now that gets won. Okay. So there's going to be a payout to the members of all the FPPS pool members. Now, the calculation is going to be, they'll look at the last 144 blocks. They'll throw out the 3 highest and the 3 lowest, average the rest. Now, if you think about it, the variance on the low side is much different than the variance on the high side.
Because it's effectively capped at 0. It's like price. It's literally capped at 0 on the downside, but you could in theory have 21 million Bitcoin in fees on the upside. Yes.
Right. And so it's part of the FPPS. I don't begrudge the pools. I mean, but they're kind of getting away with murder by just bleeding this system.
And this is a purely off-chain thing too. This is something that the pool does on their side. Is there anything visible on-chain to show what these calculations look like? Or this is basically just how their business operates?
They're black box, which is another thing. That's why I'm somewhat aghast that so much of the people that think they're in mining that are really hashing, they abdicate all the responsibility at the base layer, right? They don't run nodes. They're not creating templates. They're not getting Coinbase payouts. They also are working with pools that are black box. They don't know, Ocean is the only pool in the world where you know what percentage of the pool you are. So if you join with, and I'm just saying Foundry today, I don't mean to just belittle Foundry, but they're the biggest, right? Like if you go connect an S21 to Foundry right now, there's nothing that tells you what percentage of that pool you are. There's nothing that tells you how their calculations are being made, and there's no audit trail for anything that's happening. So there's only a trust. It's a trust factor, and I find it just so amazing because, as you would know, James, a fundamental tenet of Bitcoin is, don't trust, verify.
Run the numbers.
Yet the whole frickin' system, Ocean has less than 1% of the hash rate. You have 99% of the frickin' community that's providing the hash rate is in a complete trust system. And that trust is centered on fundamentally 2 organizations, Foundry and Antpool, plus a bunch of proxies. So, to me, that's a really bad thing. And I think this was part of the tweet that we had some interaction on. It's really not good. And then if you think about the block template creation, which we can go deeper on a little later, what you really want, if you think about it from a Bitcoin perspective, what would we want? What's our pipe dream? Well, our pipe dream should be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of different people or organizations making decisions about what they want in their mempool and what they want in their blocks, and then hashing away against those criteria. It's a very democratic process, right? And it makes the network almost completely censorship resistant at that point. But if you have only, let's say, those 2 organizations plus another 2, 3, 4 that you could add to that make over 90% of the decisions, even in the best case, you essentially have censorship because you're only letting 6 people decide, and everyone must apply filters. Okay, so we're using some there's some subtleties in these words that we're using, but you could say Bitcoin is already censored because there's such a small number of people making these decisions. Now, right now, it's very rare for a transaction to get stuck somewhere, but in essence, all of the framework is there. I'll also point out one other really important thing, and that's that it is through the block template that signaling of future protocol changes usually gets made. So if there was SegWit 3x or something like that that was sitting in front of us right now, the community would have abdicated the decision making on that to essentially just Foundry and Ampool. That's it.
And I think this really touches on, because there's a few interesting points here. You mentioned at the start that when you got into Ethereum mining, you actually didn't know anything about it, but you could mine away. And I think that's an interesting insight, because mining is this industry where you can just live in the world of power and energy and hardware, and you're somewhat disconnected from the thing that you mine in that respect, which is kind of what this abdication of things is. On the fork governance, I mean, ultimately, Bitcoin's governance is it's like a Mexican standoff. You've got the developers, you've got the users, and you've got the miners. But what we're basically saying here, and some just quick numbers, Foundry is 30% of the pools, Ant pool is 20%, via BTC 15%, and F2 pool is 10%. So, and as you mentioned, a series of those are going to be proxies plus smaller ones. So when you talk about the developers who produce the software and the code upgrades, you've got the users and the nodes who then adopt that, and you've got economic nodes in there as well. And then the miners are effectively the pools. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that if the miners were to support a soft fork, they're essentially saying that we're going to put those transactions into this block. If they don't support that soft fork and they don't include those types of transactions, or they say they're not, they can filter them, for example, if there's a protocol upgrade, you kind of need the miners to come on board. And it's quite challenging for the users and the developers to push back when you've got 6 entities that, kind of control a lot of the that mining hash power.
Yeah, very close to right. I'll correct one thing, and that's that. Let's say there was a proposal for I'm gonna just call it SegWit 3x. Okay, some new thing, right? Usually, what would happen is there would be an agreement within the community that if at any point in time, let's say over a 2,000 block period, the blocks signaled to accept SegWit 3x, okay? And there would usually be a specific bit within the block. It might be a flipping a bit for a revision level, or there are some fields within the block header that are used for the signaling. So it's not really including the transactions. It's saying, hey, I'm in. So, and the more blocks that are won by a given organization. So even just straight up, Foundry and Antpool, even without the Antpool proxies, has a majority of the network. So if it was a signal on a majority of blocks over that period, well, they would win. Now it's usually set at more like a 75% level or an 80% level, but even then, it doesn't take much. But if we had a network that had maybe no organization over, let's say, 15 or 20%, and you had 30 organizations that at least have 1%, and then you have a whole bunch of really smaller plebs and all that are out there mining. Like mathematically, if you have more than 0.25% of the world's hash power, you can probably start seriously considering being a solo miner. Okay. So at that point, you'd win a couple blocks a week. Okay. So,
so sorry, in a way, you mentioned that 30-day window. That's about right? A lot of bills are going to be in that 30-day window. So therefore, as long as you're winning enough blocks smoothed over that 30-day window, right? If you're earning 1 every 30 days, you might get 2 next month and 0 this month. Yeah. But if you're getting, 1 every couple of days or 2 a week or something, now that starts to make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, so if you look at what happened historically, we'll start out. Why did pools exist at all? And most people probably know this answer. Well, it's to smooth it out, right? So that this problem that we talked about, that's the purpose of a pool. And in my opinion, that should be really the sole purpose of a pool, is to perform some sort of a collective or cooperative that allows them. But the rest of the mining, like mining as it's defined as being connected to the network, running your mempool, making the block template selections, and hashing, that's what mining is, all those things together, that should still exist. And that's the way Ocean is designed, is to allow even very small miners to still be miners, I guess, right? You know, that you could have one S19 with 100 terahashes, but you could still do everything in that chain. And you may or may not ever be the one that wins a block. Hard to say. Statistically, you probably wouldn't. But you'd still be out voicing your opinion. And you know, I think that's crucial for us in the long run, because I don't want to take us too far from where we are and get off of it. But down the road, I think the power of block template creation will become very apparent to people. And it won't just be people, it will be governments and big financial institutions that understand it. And if we haven't built the network in a way in which it is democratized and spread out, we could get overwhelmed, and we really lay the groundwork for it. Very easy for censorship, not for Bitcoin to fail, not for necessarily 51% attacks. The purpose today isn't to scare people about that stuff, but to scare them about censorship. I think that is very real.
I'm of the view that, because in the piece that I wrote, I actually don't think that the classic 51% attack is really I don't think that's the risk, because, and the way that I simplified that is the amount of ASIC chips, like there's two ways a government, let's say a government wants a 51% attack, there's two ways they can do it. They can either go and buy 51%, or actually they have to double the hash rate to get 51.
Yeah.
Huge amount of chips, huge amount of fab space, energy. You got to explain to your taxpayers why you're spending all this money on something that's not them. It's a very impractical brute force approach, very unlikely. The other way is you co-opt a significant amount of the hash rate, or you just lean on the pools. And my base case is if there was going to be some kind of a censorship attack, they lean on the pools. In theory, you could do that with two people and get you 51%. The idea is that then they would not mine on top of the other 49% of miners' blocks. Now, the trade-off here is that if, let's just say in the extreme case, they're mining empty blocks, they want to just stop Bitcoin from transacting anything. What would happen is the fees would start to build. And as those fees build, the 49%, people can start pulling S9s out of their cupboard and dust them off and say, well, I'm going to go and collect those fees. And in theory, the 49% of hash rate has a growing incentive to come back online. So it's not as if it's a one-way street, but it is one of those incentive structures, which it would be quite disruptive in the event that it happened.
That is true. One of the things I wrote an article a few years ago. It's in Bitcoin Magazine for those interested. It's called Satoshi's Heel. And I go through the mathematics of an attack similar to you. And I say the attack, in my mind, the attack is highly unlikely to ever be 51%. I think the attack vector, I'll even back up further. I like to think of Bitcoin as money for 1,000 years. So I think one of the things we have to do is separate ourselves from the here and now and think about what could happen over a 1,000-year period. So if you think of a period that's far enough in the future from now that we can disassociate ourselves from the way that we view the world, I think that's the important thing. So let's think 30 years ahead or something like that. Well, imagine a world where most of the hash power is now sitting in just a handful of what I call elephant sites, these massive, several megawatts, couple gigawatt kind of sites. And it's also centralized in a small number of pools. Now, if that were to happen and enough period of time had gone by that no plebs were mining anymore, the S9s were now non-functional. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, there's not even hash rate on the sidelines to dust off. If the governments came in, let's say just at the moment of a difficulty adjustment, right? So we've just had a difficulty adjustment. The way I would attack it is this. The governments of the US and China and Europe, the major forces come in and say, we're just going to turn off all the hash rate. Everybody stop. And 1% is left. Kind of in the jungle somewhere, there's 1% left. Well, the problem is we have a difficulty adjustment based on this other thing. And
takes us minus 6,000 years to find a block, and then they got to find.
Well, I've actually done the math. It would be about, if we lost 99% overnight, block times would go to about 18 hours. And the problem is we're 2016 blocks away from the adjustment. So even if you assume some slow aggregation of additional hash rate, you end up with almost like 4 years to get to the difficulty adjustment.
Yeah, wow.
So then what you could do if you were the nefarious nation states is so nothing's impaired. There's no 51% attack. Nobody's Bitcoin stolen, but the network has been frozen, right? It produced 2,000 blocks in 4 years. Then what you could do is the moment that the difficulty adjustment based on the really low hash rate came in, you turn it all back on and you fly through it. Like you fly through 2,000 blocks.
Yes.
And then you turn it off again. So you could impair the network for a decade with only a few thousand blocks being produced, and that would effectively kill Bitcoin.
That's fascinating. I've never considered that, but that makes a hell of a lot of sense, actually. Yeah. That's a really interesting way to come at it.
So now, I don't think this is a probable attack, not even, but I went through this mental exercise, and like I said, it's detailed in a magazine article, Bitcoin magazine article called Satoshi's Heel, for those that want to get into the gory details. I struggled with whether to publish the article to begin with, because I said, am I providing a roadmap for the attack? But then I realized, well, I have to publish the article because it's 100% preventable. I just have to tell people why we have to, and both as an older guy, I want my message to the future, because I'm 60. I may not be here 30 years from now, right? I want that message to the future to be like, beware. Because I think I won't call out a name here, but I got into a spat's even too strong a word. I got into a Twitter tussle with one of the CEOs of one of the public miners, and some of these issues came up. And in essence, his response to my concerns was, well, don't worry, we can all just switch to another pool quickly if we have to. And what I detected from him, and what I have detected even kind of across the community, is a certain comfort and complacency, and also a lack of knowledge that worries me. Like this is my big...
And it's interesting because we have seen that happen, and that is true, by the way. It is a changing of a text file, but I agree that it may not be the only tool that you can use. And by the way, if that is your solution, the same way that you've published the attack vector, and we now need to think about how you solve that, if we've published don't worry, we'll just do this, it's like, well, that's obviously going to be quite counterable by whoever's planning to attack it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a general statement, if you talk to people, I have a technical background. If you talk to a security expert, which I am not, but whether that's a data security issue, a physical security issue, somebody at the military level, Department of Defense level, I think what they would tell you is the point in time at which they are most exposed, whenever a system or organization is most exposed, is when it doesn't feel concerned about an attack. So I think this complacency bothers me. I even see it. I'm U.S. based, and I see within the U.S. community this sigh of relief because Trump was elected. And I think overall it was positive. It was the better of the two choices for the Bitcoin community in terms of short-term opportunities. But it may have been the worst thing in the long run, because I think a lot of us were very paranoid when there was the Biden administration and we would have been on our toes. Like we would have been, if you were the CEO of a hashing or mining organization, you'd be really thinking about geographic diversity and things like that. Like you'd be.
And out of interest, what's your thoughts on what happened in 2021? Because China more or less did one of these, and we can kind of use this as empirical evidence. And we saw 40% of the hash rate migrates into the US. I think that's obviously good. Getting that is just a dispersion. But what's your thoughts on the after effect, where I think it's something like 40% of the hash rate is now in the US? What's your gut feel on that as a risk or an opportunity, or how do you think about that?
Well, I think in the long run, the U.S. government presents the biggest risk to the mining infrastructure. This doesn't mean I like China better or anything. It just, I'm a U.S. citizen, obviously, but I think who has the most at risk as Bitcoin gets more successful? It's the United States. You know, what's threatened? The U.S. control of the monetary system, the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency, the U.S. Treasury as the global reserve asset. Like those are all U.S. based things. So I think that you could almost, I don't think they're doing this, by the way. I don't think they're that smart, but you could look at it almost as a Trojan horse kind of thing where, you know, Trump saying, let's put all the mining in the U.S. I want to mine all the remaining Bitcoin in the U.S. If you remember that statement from Nashville last year. And then, yay, like I'm like, oh, no.
Yeah.
No,
strangely enough, I had the same reaction because I was in the audience when he said it. I was like, hey, guys, you know, like, I don't like this whole, like, you know, I get it. It's all well and good, but like we're politicians, right? And what happens when the other side gets in?
Yeah. Because here's the thing. So there's a lot of debates, right? I mean, should all the mining be in the U.S.? Should there be a strategic Bitcoin reserve? Is it good? Is it bad? I don't know. What I do know is we have no power to stop any of stop any of those things, right? You know, there's the different phrases like either Bitcoin's for everyone or anyone, depending on how you want to phrase it, right? And I believe that. And so if Bitcoin continues on the path that it's on, there is a level of hyper-Bitcoinization occurring. And we can't stop institutional adoption. We can't stop BlackRock and Fidelity from participating. We can't stop nation states from having global reserve currencies, and we can't stop nation states from wanting to mine. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the string, and hopefully you don't mind me taking this tangent, but what I view is I say, hey, in the end, the Bitcoin network has a finite capacity, and this is an important point if you've never thought about this, right? The Bitcoin network produces roughly 53,000 blocks a year. That's what a mean of 10-minute block times extrapolates out to. We've already had the block size wars. We have a block size limit. And the math of that says we're going to have about 4,000 transactions on average capacity in each block. That gives us 200 million-ish transactions annually. Bitcoin is absolutely scarce at 21 million. Block space is absolutely scarce in any window of time. Block space, and over time, another thing is if you look at a miner, what does a miner do today? A miner's production is Bitcoin primarily. 98% of the revenue going to miners is in the form of subsidy. But 10 years from now, my prediction is that it will be like 80-20 the other way, at least.
Yes. And I wrote about this in my piece. By definition, in the early years, fees were less than 1%. We're now in this period where through booms and busts, it goes from 2% in the bear market to 20% fees in the bull. By definition, that trends towards 100%. So whatever environment we're in right now, And this concept of the block subsidy going to zero and the risks that that presents and blah, blah, blah. By definition, fees must become 100% over time. So we are going to have to go through some kind of a regime shift for sure.
Absolutely. And I think what most companies that at least call themselves miners have not thought through this well. And so they go from being producers of Bitcoin to producers of block space. And by the way, I'm more aggressive than others. I think that within 5 years, and certainly within 8, give me 2 more halvings, we're there. That the output of miners is block space. Once you start thinking about it that way, we said this math before. If you're an organization that has control of 10% of the hash rate, then you're going to control about 5,300 blocks a year. And you're going to control about 20 million transactions a year. Okay. So, and that's how you have to extract your revenue, right? You have to extract your revenue from that. Now, like one of the products I'm working on right now with another organization was I saw this a couple years ago. And so we started working on a block space forward derivative so that miners could start selling future block space. Because if you think about block space as a commodity, and as a miner, you think of yourself as a commodity producer, then what you must do is all the stuff with FPPS was to normalize revenue, right? Well, you can do the same thing to a certain degree by selling some of your future block space. Much like if I'm a farmer and I grow corn, and I plant in May and I'm going to have an October harvest. Well, I will start selling some of that October harvest early. Even maybe even before I planted it in the ground, I have a buyer. And the buyer, this is an important part too. The buyer has an incentive. Okay. If I make corn tortillas, I need to start stabilizing my cost of goods, and so I will buy those futures, right? And block space is, if you're a user of block space, then the fact that we're sitting here in February, for instance, if you're a big user of block space and you don't know what the cost of access to the block space in June is, that's a big problem, right? So this is part of the maturation of the ecosystem are these sort of things. Now, this next part, I think, is one that probably is very controversial. But if you believe in this premise that block space is a commodity and also that it's absolutely scarce, if you think about a world where Bitcoin is a major monetary system, then access to that monetary system becomes existential to financial organizations, banks, and nation states. So what I believe this results in are them having a major mining presence. So
I am very much aligned with this. And in my piece, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was the exact same incentives of why a nation state might want to censor Bitcoin is the exact same reason why another nation state needs to have their own hash power. Because if they are the one that's going to be censored, then they need that hash power. And the last time I ran the numbers, I can't remember what transaction per block I used. It might have been like 2,500 or 3,000. But the idea is if all 8, just so people can envision this, if all 8 billion people wanted to send one transaction, it takes like 67 years for the network to process that.
Yeah, you're correct. It's many decades. It's many decades. Yeah, I give that same example in some talks that I give. I say, if I want to give Bitcoin to everybody in the world, my number's like, I think 40 some years, but it doesn't matter, right? The point being that, well, it depends on whether or not you use 4,000 or 3,000 probably.
Yes.
I bet you use 3,000, which is kind of the current average, and I use 4,000, which I think is kind of more the theoretical practical limit. But yeah, that's the point. And by the way, there's 330 million companies in the world too. So
Yes.
if you add that in, like there's not even enough base layer capacity for every company in the world to do one base layer transaction a year.
And
That's
this
how
is my
precious
base
it is.
case. Like at the end of the day, if Bitcoin's trajectory is towards global reserve asset, the probability that fees are going to be zero and demand for block space will be zero is very close to zero. It's going to be much higher. And that's why I think, like, I opened my piece by just saying, let's put aside the notion that Bitcoin succeeds and becomes this giant thing and is then going to collapse, because if it gets to the zenith that we believe it's going to and the trajectory appears to be, there's going to be a lot of demand for block space.
Yes. Now, it's important to realize, let's go back to the block template for a little bit. Okay. And kind of take this full circle to a certain degree. Now, having control of that block template is the whole key, right? I mean, you have to have associated hash rate to it. But if you have some hash rate, even a quarter of 1%, like I said before, if you have a quarter of 1%, you're going to get a couple blocks a week on average. So if you're, let's say, a nation, I give this example in some talks I give, say, if I was the president of Bolivia, pulling a random country out there, and I have 1/4 of the world's GDP, I think it's something on that order, I would be scrambling immediately now to make sure that I had a quarter of the world's hash rate in the boundaries of my country. And I would do everything I could, preferable energy rates, tax grants, no capital gains, blah, blah, blah. But the one caveat would be I would have a Bolivia pool, and anybody bringing hash rate to my country must use Bolivia pool. And that would give me this power. Now, some future U.S. president decides they hate Bolivia like the world hates Russia or North Korea right now, and I still have a country. I am still financially sovereign, economically sovereign, and I can do commerce anywhere in the world. If Bolivia has no hash rate, no block template control, they are screwed. In other words, this is existential to the existence of the nation state. Like that's the moral of that story. Like you to be a nation state in the future, you must control hash rate.
And this is something that I think is really interesting, because I came at this problem from the individual miner perspective, where individual miners can and will go bankrupt all the time. And the context of this is why the block subsidy going to zero isn't the risk that a lot of people think it is, because miners by design, whether through incentive or just because the difficulty adjustment is brutal, they must innovate, they must bring the cost side of their inputs down. It may be that mining, and when it's implemented in a grid, it makes your energy grid more secure and stable because of load demand and response and all those things. Yeah. You actually may be, like mining could be a loss leader. You may actually run mining at a loss because it makes the rest of your infrastructure more stable, or it gives you these kind of nation state level benefits.
Correct. And this extends to big financial institutions. So if I was Bank of America, if I was running Bank of America today, I would be building a significant mining organization. And what I would be doing is I would be going to all of my customers, all my major customers, and saying, hey, you do business, both your fiat business and your Bitcoin business with me. And as a privilege of that, you get, I'm going to just pull a number out of the air, you get 10 transactions a month guaranteed for free. I will guarantee you that, you can have 10 a month and you get in. And so Bank of America, this is your loss leader thing. Bank of America will not look at this as how much is a subsidy and how much is the fees. It will look at it based on the value of that relationship with large customers and important high net worth people and family offices. If I was American Express, I would go to my premier members and I would say, hey, you pay $650 a year to get your whatever card, your black card, your preferred card, whatever. And, you get 5 a year, which I know might not sound like a lot, but in the context of 200
the assumption
million,
here is that, block space is full and expensive.
Yeah, it is a highly privileged position. So these organizations will not look at the block reward as even part of their equation. It has nothing to do. They could care less. That's just a little gravy on top. They look at it based on the financial impact and control that comes from the transactions themselves and the relationships that are associated with it. And I think a lot of, I've given some talks on this a few times. Some people, I think, hate me for it because I think they view it as a destroying a lot of the essence of Bitcoin. And I agree. There are problems, but we can keep some of that by having the plebs and some smaller organizations that are right-minded at least control some of the network. But it goes back to that other thing. I can't stop them.
Yeah.
All I can do is tell you as I go through the game theory, and you and I have, I think, some similar thoughts about how this plays out. This is how I see it. And so it's the only way. Like you can't expect the world to hyper Bitcoinize and it be the new global reserve asset and the preferred monetary network of the world and not have these things happen.
And not have full blocks at all times. Yeah. And I've been of the view for some time, and I was kind of processing it a little bit, but the block subsidy, I think, is correctly named. The job of the block subsidy is to subsidize the journey from zero to what I think you're describing, right? It is the subsidy to allow us to test, break, that worked, that didn't, this business model is good, this one isn't. The subsidy allows the miners to do these things and reach that final end state of whatever that looks like. And if I kind of summarize, I think a lot of what we've talked about today, where we're at this interesting point where we can see there's problems with pool centralization, and it is a risk. But we can also see and I agree with you, I think the probable future is what you've described, where block space is very scarce, but it's that journey from here to there. That's the part that is really interesting. And I guess the question is, what kind of solutions and incentive structures do you think need to happen in order to achieve those things? Because they may be mutually linked.
Yeah, well, I'm glad. I appreciate the opportunity to come on a show like yours, because I think that this is part of that. I think that the plebs have to have a voice, and they do have a voice. I think they have gotten too quiet. There's a I forgot the year, 2014, 2015. There was a mining organization, ghash.io, and at that point in time, it started creeping up close to 50%. It was a pool. And it crept up close to 50% of the global hash rate. And the community started to go to the folks at that organization and say, hey, you got to do something, break into do something. And they didn't. And the community massacred them, drove them out of business in a year because there was a pool that didn't respond. We have a very different mindset of people. We now have the largest hashing organizations in the world feeding the big miners. We also have plebs pumping the stocks of the public companies who are the biggest users of those organizations. At a minimum, I think that the plebs have to put pressure, and the pressure they could put on right now is, if you're a shareholder of a big public company, force them to behave in the manner in which you think is best for Bitcoin. Because I think you have to make a decision, challenge each person out there. Like, you make a decision. Are you in it for the Bitcoin and the good that Bitcoin puts, that brings to the world? Or are you in it for the fiat gain of the stock prices? Or number go up. Where are you? And just be honest with yourself. If you're on that, I'm not telling you you're an evil person and you're all wrong, like you're chasing the dollar. Okay, then do it. But don't think that you're a principal Bitcoiner at the same time you're pumping the stocks and behaviors of organizations that are not in line with that same thinking. So, so I guess what I'm saying is, be careful with who you support. Know that you have a voice. it's only through this education. We have this issue though, right? I think that we have this adoption curve, and as we move along the adoption curve, we exponentially have to educate more people. That's a really hard problem, right? How do you get these people? I also say that, in my opinion, I just obviously I run mining organizations. We have plenty of hash rate, but like I just bought a BitX. I'll be installing it tonight.
I've got three sitting right in front of me.
Yeah. I challenge, encourage, whatever, everybody to just go get one. Are you going to make money? Nope, you're not. Are you going to lose money? Yep, a little bit. Are you going to learn a shitload? Yes, you will.
And my view was, there's a bunch of guys out there who are doing work developing open source miners, and that is my way of giving back and saying, you keep doing exactly what you're doing, because I feel like we're going to need this at some point in the future.
Yeah. And I might be wrong. I think sooner rather than later that, what we have is we have the mining pool centralization. You gave the numbers earlier. We have the public miners who in the last year went from 30% of global hash rate to 35. I see more and more people feel like they can't participate in mining. And, they're dropping out. I can say, though, interestingly, I don't mind competing against the big miners. That's really a bad word, because we aren't competing for customers. But I think the good news is it's going to be harder and harder for the big guys to grow hash rate economically. And I know we've been going on for a while, but what happens is there's a law of diminishing returns, right? So they still have to get energy at a very effective price. And it's getting harder and harder to go find 100 megawatts or 200 megawatts or 500 megawatts. It's taking more capital. It's taking longer. And they're fighting with the AI and the HPC and vehicle charging and these others for that very small slice of the available energy at the right price.
And so, out of interest, are we moving from a world where because I know CapEx was the dominant factor for many years, are we moving to a world where that OpEx energy access is actually more of a challenge for miners than the ASIC rigs and the CapEx itself?
Well, that's a good question. It's still going to be a challenge, in part because the thought I was on was like what we are focused on primarily going forward is producing our own energy. So we have stranded gas wells we own a small hydroelectric facility. We've just opened an anaerobic digestion facility. But we focus on 0.5 megawatt, 2 megawatts, 4 megawatts. We're not building monstrosities. We're trying to build are these smaller ones. But what we can do is we can achieve costs of energy well under what we can find anywhere on the grid, and even what the big guys can find on the grid. We just can't find it at 50 megawatts. We can find it at smaller scale. So what I'm saying is it's out there. This kind of goes back to something that's talked about a lot. There's a lot of stranded energy in the world. If you put the work in, but it does take some capital. It's actually more capital than just connecting to a spot on the grid and throwing something up, because we have to put in gas processing units and generators, and the maintenance is a little higher. But, I can tell you, like, on grid, most mining organizations in the US at least, they're going to see real cost of energy in the 3.5 to 4.5, maybe 5 cent range. That's where you see a slice. And those producing their own energy are going to be 1 to 2 cents cheaper than that, but with more CapEx.
Got it.
So I think that's where the future is, and that's almost unlimited.
I've always thought that this like small entrepreneur who goes and monetizes a landfill or a geothermal vent or something, that kind of stuff is fascinating. And what I think a lot of critics of saying, subsidy down equals bad, they're not realizing that they're innovating. Just because the difficulty adjustment forces you to innovate, you've got to find new ways to monetize energy that is cheaper. It's just how the system is designed, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and that's our for Barefoot, my company. That's our focus. We may still do a few on-grid things going forward, but I would say 70% of our future projects will be off-grid.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And what percentage of the hash rate do you reckon is off-grid?
Right now, I would still say well under 10%.
Got it.
But that can change. And I mentioned this article I wrote called Satoshi's Heel. My recommendation is, as a community, let's try to get 30% into this off-grid mining. I call it wild mining. As I use the terms wild and captive. So I call it wild mining because it is unpermissioned energy. I own it. I control it. It's generally not taxed. It's generally not regulated. It's hard to even know that I exist, especially at a smaller scale, right? Captive means you have permissioned energy. So if you're a big organization and you got a 100 megawatt facility, you may have a contract, you may have a PPA, and by the way, there are some benefits, grid balancing, blah blah blah. I'm not saying that that's not relevant, but all it takes is some legislator to decide they don't like you, and it doesn't matter that you have a PPA. You're cooked.
And we got close to this too. In the previous administration, there's rumblings of excess taxes, which is effectively a ban. These things can and will happen.
Yeah, they tried to put a 30%. The Biden administration twice tried to put a 30% tax.
It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think that we need, as a community, to get 30% wild, and we don't want what I call the elephant sites as well. So the big ones we're not going to stop them, just like we can't stop the government, and I can't stop Riot from expanding, and they probably will. But if we keep them, obviously we want them collectively. We want them under 50%, but certainly under 70%. We keep the network at a place where mathematically, the scenario I talked to you about earlier, like if we stay 30% that they can't quickly capture and turn off, then our problem really never exists. And by the way, I started that whole thought experiment. The reason I wrote that article was you mentioned the China mining ban. That's what got me thinking. When the China mining ban happened, I also talked about complacency. I think it created a complacency within the community. Like, oh, hey, we weathered this major attack.
52% or whatever it was just disappears overnight. Yep.
Yeah, whatever your number was, 40, 50, 60%. And look, we just hummed along. And that's true. We should feel good that we did that. But then I went through the exercise and say, well, how big did it have to be for it to actually have been a problem?
It makes sense. And it's that convexivity as you get bigger and bigger, as you get towards 90%, the time to recover gets massively larger. Yes.
Correct. And so that's why that article started. And I would say it was actually the impetus for me to start thinking the way that I think today, and I've had about almost 4 years now to really kind of be down this deep rabbit hole of how does this whole thing end? And while some of the things I said may be concerning, I'm still wildly optimistic. I want to be clear about that. I think Bitcoin has a very bright future. I think that we can solve all the problems that we've talked about. But Bitcoin's not perfect. It has to be maintained. It has to be cared for. And I think there's a lot of people out there that buy Bitcoin and just stand on the sidelines. And it's better than not being there. But I hope that at some point, the people that are in that mode kind of take some responsibility. Like, hey, you whatever you have, if you have 1 Bitcoin, a tenth of a Bitcoin, 100 Bitcoin, whatever, that I hope you feel some responsibility to help protect it. And that could be run a node. It could be have a miner. It could be support a developer. It could be, there's different things. But I think people that just sit there and do nothing, I think are being a bit irresponsible, and I hope they're not. Doesn't mean they have to be public, right? But I hope they can look themselves in the mirror and say, I'm not just riding on the work of other people and assuming other people are going to keep this thing working and pristine and safe, and they take some responsibility.
So as kind of like a final closing note, what would be some of the things that you would recommend? Just the average pleb, right? For me, whenever I have an opportunity to just send a Bitcoin transaction, I'll do it, because to me, it's just adding that extra network. I also do this thing where I kind of work out what my current holdings are of the Bitcoin network. How much of the mining reward do I need to accumulate over the next year? That's part of that process too. I've got my BitAxes. Where do you point a BitAxe? What's the best way? Because I know that if you just point a BitAxe to a solo pool, yes, you're running the ultimate lottery. The chance you're going to do anything, and because you're mining in your own pool by yourself with a very tiny miner, you're never going to win anything. So you're actually not really contributing to the hash rate. What can people do with their BitAxe, for example, but just different actions so that the average pleb can feel like they're doing something for the network?
I think there's a progression. First is, please buy one of those. They're I bought one for $200, right? They're not that expensive. Especially if you've never mined. And even given what I just said, if to get started you need to point it at Antpool or Foundry or whatever, that's the simplest thing to do. You're at least learning the process. You kind of see what happens. So I think that's stage one. I think stage two is to, and it's a bigger step, but point it at Ocean, and then Ocean has 4 templates that we provide, and you can pick which of the 4. So we have predefined templates. You can pick one of the 4, and then the third step, and this gets the bigger step. Then go buy a node. Run a datum server on that node and start creating your own templates. And this could be a progression over a year. It's not something. But when you get to that point, now you're managing a mempool. Now you're creating templates. Are you ever going to win one? Nope. You're not. But you'll understand this. And at some point, we are going to have to make a decision as a community about a SegWit 3x or some new activation or those sort of things. You got to know how you stand and how you want to vote on it, because I give this quote sometimes. I'm an old guy, right? So the band Rush was one of my favorites, and there's a song called Free Will, and in the song it says, when you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. And I love that. Doing
nothing is still a decision.
Yeah. So, and the only way I think to make a decision is to be educated. And so, don't look at the BitAxe or the node as investments. You're looking for some ROI on the thing. I think that, and the cost of the electricity, it's not going to happen. It's, are you expanding and growing? And I can sit here on this podcast and I can do my best to try to help. And there are others in understanding, but I can't replicate actually going out and doing it. And so participate, right? And I think a BitAxe is a great way to do it.
Bob, this has been absolutely fantastic. We've covered so many. I didn't even need to look at my notes. It's such a great conversation. I love the idea, and I'm going to think about this a lot more, this idea of block space as the commodity. I've come across that idea in passing, but I've never properly digested what it means. I think that's such a great framework, and it actually really does fit into this, where I see mining going long term. But thanks so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, James. Great to see you.
Cheers.